Good afternoon and welcome to the National Press Club. My name is Mick Rood and I'm a member of the Board of Governors of the club, and I am the editor of Biotech Daily, a King Publishing Group newsletter. I'd like to welcome club members and their guests in the audience today, as well as those of you who are listening to this program on National Public Radio or watching on C-SPAN. If you here have any questions for our speaker, please write them on the cards provided at your table and pass them up to me. I'll answer as many as I possibly can. When we first started dickering with Dr. Crichton about speaking here last year, and right up until about 2 or 3 weeks ago, we thought he would talk about genetic engineering gone awry. Then we heard that sexual harassment was the topic. Then again, we were told that Japanese-U.S. relations and the media's role would be the subject. Clearly, this is a man of narrow interests. Our guest today is one of those lucky individuals who knew from an early age exactly what he wanted to do with his life. He wanted to be a writer. When he received grades of C and C+ on his English papers at Harvard, he decided it was Harvard, and not him, that was in error. So he conducted a little experiment. For the next assignment, a paper on Gulliver's Travels, he retyped an essay by George Orwell and submitted it as his own. Now, obviously, if caught, he would have been expelled for plagiarism. But Michael Crichton, at age 18, was so convinced that the instructor was wrong about writing styles and poorly read as well, that he went ahead and took the chance. George Orwell got a B- at Harvard. The experience that prompted Michael Crichton to switch out of the English department and study anthropology. He kept writing and eventually put himself through Harvard Medical School by turning out paperback novels under the pseudonym on the weekends. He wrote a spy thriller in 9 days, and his acclaimed work, The Andromeda Strain, was sold to the movies for a lot of money when he was in his last year of medical school. That very public success made it respectable for Crichton to quit medicine, a decision he had earlier likened to quitting the Supreme Court to become a bail bondsman. By the time Michael was 30, he thought he had run out of goals. He had a medical degree. He'd published 2 best-selling novels. He'd made a movie. He'd climbed the Great Pyramid. Other than a premature midlife crisis, what was left? Plenty, it turns out. 2 of Michael Crichton's 9 novels, Rising Sun and Jurassic Park, are bestsellers. Each will be in the movie theaters later this year. Steven Spielberg is bringing to life the dinosaurs of Jurassic Park through special effects, including a lizard-like Tyrannosaurus Rex, the size of this ballroom. It promises to be the summer movie. The movie version of Rising Sun is likely to stir criticism for Crichton. Movie critics and editorial writers have assailed the book's central thesis that the Japanese government is methodically expanding its domination of American industry. Crichton wrote Rising Sun as a wake-up call for Americans, but was disturbed when critics saw it as a racist attack on Japanese. He will address the media's role in the controversy in his talk today, last I heard. Crichton has been called the father of the techno-thriller. His next novel, his 9th, is due out in the fall. It is based on the issue of sexual harassment. Let's give the very versatile and very prolific Michael Crichton a warm Press Club welcome.
Thank you, Mick. It's interesting to hear these things that you said in the past quoted to you that you don't have any recollection about at all anymore. It's nice that they're funny. I'm here before you today as the author of a novel about dinosaurs, a novel about U.S.-Japan trade relations, and a forthcoming novel about sexual harassment. This is what some people have called my dinosaur trilogy. But I wanted to talk today about another dinosaur, one that I have the strong feeling is on the road to extinction. I'm referring to the American media, and I mean extinction literally. In my own mind, it's likely that what we now think of as the mass media will be gone within 10 years, vanished without a trace. There's been evidence of this impending extinction for some time. We all know the statistics about the decline in newspaper readership and network television viewership. The polls, which increasingly show negative attitudes in the public toward the press and the media, and with good reason. A generation ago, Patty Chayefsky's network looked like outrageous farce. Today, when Geraldo Rivera bares his buttocks, when the New York Times misquotes Barbie the doll, and NBC fakes news footage of Chevy trucks, network looks like a documentary. According to recent polls, large segments of the American population think the media is attentive to trivia and indifferent to what really matters. They also believe that the media does not report the country's problems, but instead is a part of them. Increasingly, people perceive no difference between the narcissistic, self-serving reporters asking the questions and the narcissistic, self-serving politicians who refuse to answer. And I'm troubled by the media's response to these criticisms. We hear the old professional line, sure, we've got problems. We could always do our job better. Or there's the time-honored, we've always been disliked because we're the bearer of bad news. It comes with the territory, I'll start to worry when the press is liked. Or after a major disaster like the NBC News fiasco, we hear, this is a time for reflection. These responses suggest to me that the media just doesn't get it, doesn't understand why the consumers are now unhappy with their wares. It reminds me a lot of the story of the man who decided to kill his wife by having a lot of sex with her. Pretty soon you see this beaming, healthy, robust woman followed by a wizened little guy with a cane who turns to a friend and says, she doesn't know it yet, but she's only got 2 weeks to live. In any case, it's the perception that the media and our current concept of news is outmoded that I would like to address today. So for a moment, let's set aside the usual bromides about the press. Let's take it as given that the bearer of bad news is often executed, that all human beings have an appetite for gossip and scandal, that the media must attract an audience, and that bias is in the eye of the reader as much in the pen or the soundbite of the reporter. And let's talk instead about quality. The media are an industry and their product is information. Along with many other American industries, the American media produce a product of very poor quality. Its information is not reliable, it has too much chrome and glitz, its doors rattle, it breaks down almost immediately, and it's sold without a warranty. It's flashy, but it's basically junk. So people have begun to stop buying it. Poor product quality results in part from the American educational system, which now graduates workers too poorly educated to generate high-quality information. In part, it's a problem of nearsighted management that encourages profits at the expense of quality. In part, it's a failure to respond to changing technology. And in large part, it's a failure to recognize the changing needs of the audience. In recent decades, many American companies have undergone the painful, wrenching changes that restructuring produces in order to create high-quality products. We all know what this requires: flattening the corporate hierarchy, moving critical information from the bottom up instead of the top down, empowering workers, changing the system, not just the focus of the corporation, and relentlessly driving toward a quality product. because improved quality demands a change in the corporate culture, a radical change. Generally speaking, the American media has remained aloof from this process. There have been some positive innovations in recent years, like CNN and C-SPAN. But the news on television and in newspapers is generally perceived as less accurate, less objective, less informed than it was a decade ago. Because instead of focusing on quality, the media have tried to be lively or engaging, selling the sizzle, not the steak, the talk show host, not the guest, the format, not the subject. And in doing so, I would argue it has abandoned its audience. Who will be the GM or IBM of the 90s? The next great institution in America to find itself obsolete and outmoded while obstinately refusing to change. I suspect one answer would be the New York Times and the commercial networks. Other institutions have been pushed to improve their quality. Ford now makes a better car than it has at any time in my life, and we can thank Toyota and Nissan for that. But who will push the New York Times? The answer, I think, is technology. The media has always been driven by technology, and it's surprising how many of its attitudes and even terminology are very old. Stereotype and cliché are 18th century printers' terms referring to metal type. The inverted pyramid story structure is a response to the then newly invented telegraph. Reporters were not sure they could get the whole story in before the telegraph broke down, and so they began to send the most important information first. The first image broadcast on television was a dollar sign, setting the tone for the future of that medium. But the modern thrust of technology, I would argue, is radically different because it is changing the very concept of information in our society. Information today is vitally important. We live by it. We are an information society. For the first time in our history, by the year 2000, 50% of all American jobs will require at least 1 year of college. In this environment, news isn't entertainment. It's a necessity. We need it, and we need it to be of high quality, comprehensive and factually accurate. More and more, people understand that they pay for information. Online databases charge by the minute. As the link between payment and information becomes more explicit, consumers will naturally want better information. They'll demand it, and they'll be willing to pay for it. There is going to be, I would argue there already is, a market for extremely high-quality information, what quality experts would call Six Sigma information. A sigma, just as an aside, a sigma is a standard deviation, and the trendsetter for benchmarking American quality has always been, list 10 years or so, Motorola. And Motorola, until about '89, was talking about 3 sigma quality, which is 99.7% or 3 bad parts in 1,000. Motorola then made the jump to 6 sigma, which is 3 bad parts in 1,000,000. It's a quantum jump, virtually unknown in American business, although the Japanese have been doing it for years. All I'm trying to say here is that this kind of rigorous approach to what's being made and how we're doing has never been applied to the media. In my own case, when I add up what I spend for newspapers, magazines, books, databases, cable services, and so on, I find that I spend about as much for information, food for thought, as I do for food. I may not be typical, but I'm hardly unique. And I don't pay all this money because I think I'm getting good information. I pay to find out what Ken Kesey used to call the current fantasy, what is being written and brooded about. But what if somebody offered a service with really high-quality information? A service where all the facts were true, where the quotes weren't piped, where the statistics were presented by someone who knew something about statistics. What would that be worth? A lot. Because good information has value. The notion that news is filler between the ads is an outdated idea. There's a second and related trend here. I want direct access to the information that interests me, and increasingly I expect to get it. This is a long-standing trend in many technologies. When I was a kid, telephones had no dials. If you wanted to place a call, you picked it up and talked to an operator who placed the call for you. Now, if you've ever had the experience of being in a situation where someone else has to place your calls, you realize how exasperating and frustrating that is. We can all do it faster and better ourselves. Today's media equivalent of the old telephone operator is Dan Rather, or the front page editor, or the reporter who prunes the facts in order to be lively and vivid. Increasingly, I want to remove those filters, and in some cases I already can. When I read that Ross Perot appeared before a congressional committee, I am no longer solely dependent on the lively and vivid account in the New York Times, which talks about Perot's folksy homilies and Frank Capra, and gives a lot of other flashy chrome trim that I'm not interested in. I can turn on C-SPAN and watch the hearing myself. In the process, I can also see how accurate the New York Times account was, and that's likely to change my perception of the New York Times, as indeed it has. Because it does seem that the New York Times has a problem with Ross Perot. It reminds me of the story about Hearst, who remarked upon seeing an adversary in the street, "I don't know why he hates me. I never did him a favor." But my ability to view C-SPAN brings us to the third trend, the coming end of the media's information monopoly. For 200 years, since the inception of this nation, the American Revolution was the first war fought in part through opinion in public newspapers. And Benjamin Franklin was the first media-savvy lobbyist to employ techniques of disinformation. For 200 years, the media has been able to behave in a basically monopolistic way. The media has treated information the way John D. Rockefeller treated oil, as a commodity in which the distribution network, rather than product quality, was of primary importance. But once people can get the raw information themselves, that monopoly ends. And that means big changes soon. Once Al Gore gets the fiber optic highways in place and the information capacity of this country is where it ought to be, where it should have been several years ago, then I will be able, for example, to view any public meeting of Congress on tape. And I will have artificial intelligence agents roaming the databases, downloading stuff I'm interested in, and assembling for me a front page or a nightly news show that addresses my interests. I'll have the 12 top stories that I want, I'll have short summaries available, and I can double-click for more detail. How will Peter Jennings or McNeil Lehrer or a newspaper compete with that? So the media institutions will have to change. And of course, I still don't know what I don't know, which means broad-based overviews or interpretive sources will have value. But only if these sources engage in genuinely high-quality interpretive work or genuinely high-quality investigative work. At the moment, neither occurs very often. On the contrary, superficiality is the norm, and everybody in the world knows it. When Barry Lopez went to a remote Eskimo village in 1986, one of the residents asked him how long he was staying. Before he could answer, another Eskimo jumped in and said, 1 day, newspaper story. 2 days, magazine story. 5 days, book. Even in the Canadian Northwest, the audience seems to be way ahead of the press. Moving closer to home, let's consider some questions that journalists have recently asked public figures. I invite you to guess the answers. Mr. Cantor, are you a protectionist? No. Mr. Christopher, do you think your Mideast trip was a waste of time? No. Mr. Aspen, do you think we'll really see homosexuals accepted in the military? Yes. Mr. Stephanopoulos, did the White House treatment of Kimba Woods hurt the administration? No. Mr. Reich, do you think the Clinton stimulus package will do enough to create jobs? Yes. There are 2 points to be made here. The first is that the structure of the questions dictates the answer. Because no one is going to say that he's a protectionist or a time waster, or that he's promoting policies that will fail. The more important point is that such questions assume a simplified either-or version of reality to which no one really subscribes. In the real world, no one is a protectionist. Because in the real world, there's no such thing as a free market. Haven't you noticed how many free market advocates want tenure? So what we really want to know from Mr. Cantor is not some general characterization of his approach, because that characterization is too simplistic to be useful. What we want to know is his thinking on specific trade issues. Even to say, what's your approach on Japan, is too simplistic, because it's highly unlikely that Mr. Cantor thinks the same way about semiconductors, automobile parts, rice, and flat panel displays. No simple answer will satisfy the complex questions he faces, and no one imagines it does except the press. This is one reason why so many people who regularly interact with the press come to view it as an anomaly in their lives. They go about their daily work, which is specific and complex, and then they meet with the press, where interactions are general and oversimplified. Why? One answer is that it's very easy for the press to behave this way. You don't have to be knowledgeable about trade to ask Mickey Cantor if he's a protectionist. In fact, you don't have to know much to ask any question that takes the general form of, are we doing enough? Or are we going too fast or too slow? Or is it fair? Or is it really the best way to go about it? I would argue this whole journalistic procedure is a way to conceal institutional incompetence. Consider the following. I don't know very much about the military and I don't follow it. Someone says to me, okay, Crichton, you're doing an interview with Les Aspin. You have 2 hours to prepare. What am I going to ask? Well, let's see. I know he's been in the hospital for some reason. I'll inquire about his health, but I don't want to be obvious, so I'll frame it as a national security issue. Are you fit to do the job? And let's see. Oh, I'll ask him about base closings. Are there too many? Is it happening too fast? Is the process fair? Then I'll ask him about defense conversion. Are we doing enough for unemployed engineers? Is it happening too slow? Is the process fair? And let's see. Waste and procurements. Wasn't there a $600 toilet seat? I know it was a few years ago, but it's always good for a few minutes. Then the Soviet Union. Should we be downsizing so fast with all the uncertainty in the world? Then I'll ask him about gays in the military. Was Clinton's approach wise? Is this really the best way to go about it? And that should do it. Unfortunately, that is the standard Les Aspin interview. But my point is, I don't know anything about the military. I managed to do this interview because the questions are structured very generally. This generality creates a fundamental asymmetry between subject and journalist, and ultimately between journalist and audience. Les Aspin has to know much more detail. He has to address very specific pressures to carry out his job. But I can frame very general questions and get away with doing mine. How do I justify my position? Well, I can tell myself that I'm too busy to do better because the news rushes onward. But that's not really satisfactory. Better to say the American people don't want details. They just want the basics. In other words, I can blame my own shoddy behavior on the audience. And if I hear the audience criticizing me, I can say I'm being blamed as the bearer of bad news, instead of what is really going on, which is that my customers are telling me that my product is poorly researched and often either uninteresting or irrelevant. It's junk food journalism, empty calories. The media's tendency to be general instead of specific has many unhappy consequences. It is inherently superficial. It's also inherently speculative because it focuses on attitudes, what a person thinks, and not on what they do. But what a person thinks is far less important than what they do, particularly because the two are very often contradictory. And the tendency to characterize a person's beliefs instead of focusing on their actions is one of the true abuses of the power of the media. Look how quickly Kimba Woods was transformed from respected jurist to Playboy bunny. Just as I went from normal author to racist Japan basher. In my case, What was striking was how many journalists applied the Japan-bashing label without appearing to have read my book. The hazards of this practice became clear in a few months when the Columbia Journalism Review reported last December that the term Japan-bashing was invented by an American public relations flack at the Japan Economic Institute, which is an organization run by the Japanese Foreign Ministry. The term was promoted as a way to stifle debate, including legitimate debate, on relations with Japan. The man who coined the phrase said, "Anyone who uses that term is my intellectual dupe." Worse still, characterization lies at the heart of the impulse to polarize every issue, what we might call the crossfire syndrome. We're all assumed these days to reside at one extreme of the opinion spectrum or the other. We are pro-abortion or anti-abortion, nothing in between. We are free traders or protectionists, nothing in between. We are pro-private sector or pro-big government. We are feminists or chauvinists. But in the real world, few of us hold these extreme views. There is instead a spectrum of opinion. The extreme positions of the crossfire syndrome require extreme simplification, which often leads to framing the debate in terms which ignore the real issues. For example, when I watch Crossfire or Nightline or McNeil-Lehrer, I often think, wait a minute. The real issue isn't term limits, it's campaign finance reform. The real issue isn't whether a gasoline tax is regressive, it's national security, whether we'd prefer to go back to war in the Gulf instead of reducing oil consumption by taxing it more heavily as every other nation does. The real issue isn't whether the U.S. should have an industrial policy, it's whether the one that we have, because no policy is a policy, whether that policy serves us well. The issue isn't whether Mickey Cantor is a protectionist, it's how the U.S. should respond to its foreign competitors. All this reminds me of the riddle that Abraham Lincoln used to ask. You probably know this. He said, how many legs does a dog have if you include the tail as a leg? And the answer is 4, because the tail is not a leg, even if you say it is. The polarization of issues has contributed greatly to our national paralysis, because it posits false choices which stifle the kind of a debate that's essential for change to occur. It's ironic that this should happen at a time of great social upheaval in our country, when we need more than ever to be able to experiment with different viewpoints. But in the media world, a previously established idea, like an incumbent politician, enjoys a tremendous advantage over any challenger. Hence, the familiar ideas continue to be repeated long past their demonstrated validity. More than 2 decades after right-brain, left-brain thinking was discredited in scientific circles, those metaphors are still casually repeated in the media. After 30 years of government efforts to banish racism, persistent racial inequality suggests the need for fresh perspectives. Those perspectives are rarely heard. And more than 3 decades after the women's movement began amid media ridicule, the men's movement finds itself ridiculed in exactly the same way, often by leading feminists who appear to have learned little from their own ordeals. This leads me to the final consequence of generalization. It characterizes our opponents as well as the issues. There has been a great decline in civility in this country. We have lost the perception that reasonable persons of goodwill may hold opposing views. Simultaneously, we have lost the ability to address reasoned arguments, to forsake ad hominem characterization, and instead address another person's views, which is a tragedy, because debate is interesting. It's a form of exploration. But personal attack is merely unpleasant and intimidating. Paradoxically, this decline in civility and good humor, which the press apparently appears to believe is necessary to get the story, reduces the intensity of our national discourse. Watching British parliamentary debates, I noticed that the tradition of saying the right honourable gentleman or my distinguished friend before hurling an insult does something very interesting to the process. A civil tone actually permits more bluntness. So, my distinguished friends, I I hope that this era of polarized junk food journalism will soon come to an end. For too long, the media has accepted the immortal advice of Yogi Berra, who said, "When you come to a fork in the road, take it." But business as usual doesn't serve the audience anymore. And although technology will soon precipitate an enormous change in the media, we face a more immediate problem, a period of major social change in this country. We're going to need a sensitive, informed, and responsive media to accomplish those changes. And that's the way it is. Thank you very much.
I got another one for you. This isn't over till it's over. I'm almost afraid to ask him a question. Fortunately, most of them, if not all of them, were asked by members of the audience. Mr. Crichton, will your next novel be a success? Seriously now, what can a reporter who largely agrees with your criticisms of the press do to change the nearsighted vision of his editors, when every suggested attempt at quality improvement falls on deaf ears? We're asking advice.
Yeah. Very, very tough problem. You know, W. Edwards Deming said that in general, 85% of quality problems are at the feet of management. Which is probably about right. I think that there are things that you can lobby for, but it's a very difficult problem, and I understand very well that people in your position are often blamed for a system that is out of your control. It's like blaming American automobile workers for lousy American cars. It's not their problem. They didn't build the line. They didn't set it all up. They didn't engineer the cars, but they're stuck. So I understand that. Can't help you.
Your vision of a quality information publication is grand, but it would reach or appeal to but a very few. If you doubt me, consult most any readership survey.
Okay, this reminds me of the time-honored discussion, which I certainly faced when I set out to write a novel about economic issues. The time-honored view that Americans aren't interested in economics, they don't care, they won't pay attention to it, that's why we can't put it on television, that's why we can't put it in newspapers. And along comes Ross Perot with a couple of charts and a pointer, and he gets a larger audience than the World Series. Yeah, there's a certain level where I think that people believe something isn't true and they haven't tried it. And that view is something for which I have very little sympathy. The other thing is what I'm trying to express to you, I think, is that there is a segment of your audience which is migrating upward very fast and which is looking for sources of better and better information. And the notion of the lowest common denominator, which very often is kind of subtext of any discussion, the lowest common denominator isn't going to cut anymore. If we want to talk about the problems of having a two-tiered society, that's another discussion. We do have a two-tiered society. It is a problem. But meanwhile, the users of information that are really able to use it are pushing in another direction. And the lowest common denominator is of no interest.
It sounds as if you've been burned by the press. Doesn't even sound that way. Is your personal experience with the media criticism the driving force behind your analysis of the news business?
Well, yes and no. That's a good answer. You see, I have two experiences. One is that I alternate in my ordinary life between being the subject of your attentions and then going and doing in some form something very similar to the job that you do. So I experience not only in this alternating way the effect of being at the receiving end of your attentions, but I also have a chance to see what's happening to the people that I'm talking to and how they are progressively treating me as a journalist, as a member of the press who's coming to ask them questions. And all of that is changing dramatically. It's very much more difficult for me to get people to talk to me than it was at some time in the past. And in fact, since I seem to be more of a celebrity, you'd think it'd be easier. But it's harder because there's increasingly strong attitudes about, if you're a journalist, I don't want to deal with you because I know what kind of a person you are. You're coming in with an agenda, you're going to ask me stupid questions, you're going to write up stuff that isn't true, and you're going to make me look like a fool. And I understand how people can come to feel that way. But now I'm trying to do the job, and I'm only experiencing the sort of difficulties that are there. So,
could you give us some examples of some mistreatment you have suffered in the media?
Oh, gosh. I guess the easiest way to talk about this is to say that at a certain point, there's a frightening thing that's going on now, which is that in some odd way, we are going back to a 19th century sense of reputation. You know, where one's reputation exists, it has value, it's important, and one fears for it to be damaged. And I am, for example, very aware that however successful my books are, and they are very successful, many more people will see the newspaper headlines than will ever read the books. Many more people will take the skimmed surface of what is said about me than will see those things. So that, for example, I have many Japanese friends who, although they read English, are not comfortable about it. And for a period of 6 months between the publication in the United States of Rising Sun and the Japanese translation, they were uneasy. You know, they were saying, you know, people are coming to me saying I shouldn't be your friend because you say all these terrible things about Japanese people. And you know, the Japanese restaurant where I eat lunch every day, one day the guy who owns it came over with a copy of the LA Times and said, "Is this you?" You know, I said, "Yes, it was." And I was one of the earliest consumers of translated copies of my own book because I had to send them to all these people so that they could see what it was all about. And they, of course, went, "No, it's true."
In view of increasing demands on people's time, doesn't a large segment of the public depend increasingly on analysts as filters?
The whole notion, the whole notion of compression, I think, is suspect at the point when you begin to recognize that there are subject areas for all of us where we're very interested and we want to know a lot, areas where we want to know a certain amount, areas where we just want, in essence, headlines. And all those things vary. And the notion that I don't have the time to pay attention to what is of interest to me is a false notion. I mean, what matters to me, the things that affect my ability to work, the things that affect my income, the things that, you know, the subjects that I'm involved with, whatever that may be. I mean, all the time that it takes. You know, and what I'm trying to say back to you is that very often I have a heck of a hard time in the traditional mass media getting the information in a good enough form. And I think I'm not the only person who feels that way.
You are driving this old copy editor crazy. Sometimes you use a plural verb with the word media, and sometimes you use a singular verb. Which is it?
Thank you very much. At a late point in writing this speech, I went through and made media plural throughout. But as I speak, what can I say? You have to deal with transcripts. It's difficult.
Fair enough. Aren't politicians, including the president, responsible for simplification and polarization of the various public debates on various issues?
Yes and no. You know, I think that polarization is a trick that works for lots of people. It's a way of heightening attention. It's a way of exaggerating all kinds of things. It's a way of trying to get people to cross the line. But you know, in the real world, it's not always the Alamo. You know, I mean, life isn't like that. And in a tremendous number of social decisions that our country faces, we're unable to do it. You know, I mean, I'm always struck by the notion that Catholic countries like France and Italy can come to a conclusion about abortion, whereas the United States cannot. You know, and I think at some point the reality that we have to face is what E.J. Downs says, that we're presented with extremes, whereas the truth is that the majority of Americans are all somewhere in the middle. You know, maybe in one direction or another. And yet we're not acknowledging that. We're not dealing with that. We're not making room for that. And it's very hard. You know, if my choices are either to be entirely in favor of abortion without any limitation or any education at all, or entirely against abortion ever, no matter what the medical circumstances at all, then it's going to be hard for me to make a decision. I don't like either one.
In your book, Rising Sun, I sometimes found awkward or unnecessary Japanese expressions, e.g., calling the junior person kohai. Did you write them on your own, or did you ask a native Japanese to translate? Did you realize there are many readers, both Americans and Japanese, who understand the Japanese language and possibly might be disturbed by it? Long question, I'll leave it here.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, very interesting. I had actually 3 translators at the point where I realized that it was very difficult to get it clear. And I was advised at an early point that what we're talking about is that the 2 policemen in Rising Sun have what is called a senpai-kohai relationship. And the senior man, the senpai, refers to the junior man as kohai, which does not happen. I mean, he has that, but he would never be referred to that way in speech. I had a different problem, you know, which was that I'm writing a book for an American audience, and so I took this liberty. And I would say, by the way, that how I think about, this is the second book that I've done, which is addresses in some way another culture. I also did a book about Victorian England. And when the book was sent to the English publishers, they got very disturbed. You know, they said, well, it's just not right. And I think many Japanese have perceived that it's just not right. And I think that we can have a sense of that. I don't know if any of you have ever read Westerns that are written by British authors, you know, where the cowboys always end up saying things like, right you are, partner. And, you know, we have that distinct sense that it's just off, you know, maybe off a little bit, maybe off a lot. But it's clearly done by someone who is not a member of this culture, who isn't immersed in that and who doesn't have a true feel for it. What can I say? I'm not Japanese, I'm not British. One does the best one can. And in some way, it's kind of interesting, if you're knowledgeable, to see where the mistakes are.
In your novel, Jurassic Park, you warn against dangerous genetic engineering. Did you consider yourself, or do you consider yourself, in the same camp as activist Jeremy Rifkin, who is currently campaigning against engineered tomatoes? Why or why not?
Good extreme question. Well, at least I view Rifkin as an extreme person. I have a slightly different view of this, because the problem with genetic engineering, as I mentioned in the book, is that unlike previous fundamental technologies in science, for example, atomic technology, it's very broad-based, it's very inexpensive. I mean, you're soon going to have little old ladies in tennis shoes in their backyards using genetic engineering techniques to grow roses. It's not a difficult thing at all. You can buy kits for it in the back of Science magazine. And this makes it very different from atomic technology, which really requires a government to be able to do it. You need that much money. You need to build huge plants. This is not something that you can do in your basement. Genetic engineering, for better or worse, is. It's being done all around the world for a tremendous number of companies and a tremendous number of reasons. And the notion of how to control it, it seems to me, therefore must address its nature. And unless we can start to have scientists themselves who are more thoughtful and who are forming peer groups and who are beginning to consider what directions this research ought to go in, and I would tell you that I've certainly had conversations with some people in genetic engineering who have told me that they have turned away from lines of research themselves and don't care any longer about the traditional notion that scientists have had, which is, I might as well do it because if I can think of it, so can someone else, and someone else will sooner or later do it, so why don't I do it? These people are taking a different view, which is that some lines of research are inherently too dangerous, and let's not. And if someone else does, too bad, but I won't do it. And I think we're going to see more and more of those attitudes. I hope so.
Is there a parallel between the biotech analogy or genetic engineering industry and the nuclear industry in that both are surrounded by some people who might be called extremists, and that both, perhaps, nuclear in the past, biotech today, have become a little smug, a little overconfident, and a little fascinated by the science without thinking about its ramifications?
Short answer is yes. The handling of fundamental technologies is a very difficult problem. One of the things that I wanted to do in Jurassic Park, or one of the themes that I wanted to play with, is that what we've seen over and over again, for example, in 3 Mile Island and in Chernobyl, it isn't that the engineers were too dumb to build in safety systems. They built them in, but the people turned them off. Now you have a different sort of problem if you say, well, we have a safety system, but it can't ever be turned off. That doesn't seem like a good idea. Under what circumstances ought it to be turned off? I don't think there are simple answers to any of this. And what I felt in the early years of the nuclear power controversy in this country was that we weren't having a very informed discussion about the two prongs of this issue, or really there are three. One is, what are you going to do with the waste? No good answer. Second one is exactly how hazardous is this technology, and what are the ways that we can control those hazards? For example, very often a German or Japanese construction firm will come in to build a nuclear plant, and they will guarantee it. An American firm will not. Okay, what are they doing that we're not doing? What is there to know about that? Third thing is, what are the alternatives? I often said that in the decision not to use nuclear power in this country, which was around the time of that movie Michael Douglas did, the China Syndrome, that was really demonstrating was that trees don't vote in this country, because your alternative, which was to use coal power, is going to produce a lot of acid rain, a lot of warming, a lot of other kinds of difficulties that we don't have good solutions to either. So instead of facing a problem which is really balanced between difficult alternatives, we'd all like to have energy without any pollution. But in fact, there are problems with every source of energy. And I was recently reading an article about wind power where somebody was complaining about the visual pollution that comes from all these propellers on the hillsides.
Back to Jurassic Park again. Does the Spielberg production focus closely on the biotech aspect? Will the movie spark a fear of the technology?
No, the movie version of Jurassic Park is not much of a text on biotechnology. The Spielberg version focuses on the dinosaurs. And I think, I doubt very much that anyone will be afraid of biotechnology as a result of the movie. I think a lot of people may be afraid of dinosaurs. To the extent that you have this fear, you're on your own.
genetically engineered dinosaurs. How much research did you do in writing Jurassic Park, and how did you go about doing it?
I'm very interested in the questions that I'm asked about research in general, because it seems to convey to me a sense that it's not clear exactly what I do. I'm often asked, for example, if I went to Costa Rica when I was working on Jurassic Park, because that's where it's set. The answer is no, and I don't know any reason why I should go. I didn't go to Tokyo when I was writing Rising Sun, a novel that's set entirely in Los Angeles. In the case of Jurassic Park, the biggest problem, in fact, was to make the dinosaurs. And if you think about it, it's a very uphill problem to get groups of adults, and in a sense even worse, children, to believe in dinosaurs on a page, even for a couple of hours. We all know, unlike some of the other things that I've written, the Andromeda strain about a satellite that comes back with a plague or something, we all have somewhere a feeling, well, that could be true. But we're all certain that there aren't any dinosaurs. So for me to try and convince you of that concept is a large problem, and I spent a lot of time doing it. The thing that I didn't know until I actually got there was, of course, there's absolutely no information about the behavior of dinosaurs at all that's really known. No one knows a thing about their appearance. No one knows a thing about their skin texture, skin color, social behavior. We have some deductions. We have some ideas, but nothing is known. So in my work, I used a tremendous number of illustrators, who I all thanked in the back of the book, and I looked at all those pictures and tried to make up the behavior. I also did I guess I do a certain kind of acting out, because one day my secretary came in, and I think she thought I was having a seizure. I was sitting at my typewriter going, and what I was doing was trying to get, raptor movements right.
Could I have a brief answer on this, but a quality answer? We're running out of time. Biotechnology has been singled out by the Clinton administration as one of the country's most vital industries. Do you agree with that assessment?
Yes, it is. There's absolutely no question about it. It's a tremendously powerful technology. It holds the good part is it can change almost every aspect of our lives, from what we wear to how we live to what medicines we have to what diseases we're subject to. The bad part is it can change almost every aspect of our lives, and there are some very frightening scenarios, but I believe in it.
Before I ask the last question, I'd like to give you a certificate of appreciation and a copy of the book, The North American Indians, a beautifully illustrated volume. I hope you'll agree. Last question. What was your first pseudonym?
It was John Lang. My first name is John, and as a child I'd enjoyed the books of Andrew Lang, who collected fairy tales, and I thought that I was writing fairy tales for adults, so I took John Lang.